The hospital sat at the edge of the city like a forgotten sentinel of the past, its walls crumbling, windows boarded, and paint peeling in long vertical streaks that caught the evening sunlight in eerie patterns. Locals avoided the area, whispering of strange occurrences, vanishing patients, and the kind of experiments that could only be described as cruel. Even the bravest of urban explorers admitted that stepping inside sent shivers down their spine, as though the building itself were aware of every secret it held. Rusted wheelchairs and broken gurneys were scattered across the overgrown grounds, remnants of a time when this place was alive with the sounds of medical machines, urgent footsteps, and hushed voices. The abandoned medical wing, in particular, had earned a reputation that bordered on legend. It had been sealed decades ago, officially decommissioned, but rumors suggested that the reasons were far darker. Whispers of patients who had vanished without a trace, doctors who performed unauthorized procedures, and nurses who either looked the other way or were too terrified to speak out had circulated for years. Urban legends painted the wing as haunted, not by ghosts, but by the echoes of human suffering, screams that seemed to linger in the very walls. When the city announced plans to finally demolish the building, many assumed it would be a routine teardown, a matter of clearing unsafe property for redevelopment. Contractors walked the perimeter, mapping out the days it would take to bring the structure down. But as soon as workers approached the sealed entrance of the forbidden wing, a palpable tension settled over the team. Some spoke of an overwhelming sense of dread, a weight pressing down on their shoulders as they tried to rationalize the fear creeping into their minds. The gate itself seemed to resist their presence, chains rattling inexplicably as if warning them to turn away. Inside, shadows clung to the corners, elongating with the fading light of the afternoon. Dust particles danced in the beams of the workers' flashlights, and the air carried a musty, metallic tang that made the stomach churn. Every creak of the floorboards and whisper of the wind through broken windows seemed magnified, echoing down long, empty corridors lined with faded tiles. The deeper the workers moved into the wing, the more they noticed details that were impossible to ignore. A gurney still stained with what could only be described as old blood, a rusted surgical instrument left mid-procedure, and walls scrawled with illegible writing, like the frantic notes of someone trying to make sense of chaos. Even before any screams were heard, the building seemed alive with anticipation. There was a sense that this place had been waiting, patiently, for decades, for someone to step inside and witness its secrets. The workers felt a strange pull, a combination of curiosity and instinctive fear. No one spoke much, the silence was oppressive, thick with the weight of history. As they reached the end of the corridor, a faint echo seemed to slither through the walls, impossible to place, neither human nor mechanical, something that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand on end. And then, just as the last light of day dipped behind the horizon, it began, a scream. High-pitched, desperate, undeniably human. It reverberated through the corridors, bouncing off walls that had long forgotten the sound of living voices. The workers froze, every instinct screaming at them to flee, yet an invisible tether rooted them to the spot. Something was inside, and whatever it was, it didn't want to be discovered. The air grew colder, heavier, and the building seemed to exhale, as if acknowledging that its secrets were no longer safe. The screams faded as suddenly as they began, leaving behind a silence that was somehow louder, more threatening than before. No one spoke, eyes met in the dim light, wide and unblinking, each person silently acknowledging the unthinkable. Whatever had lived in the forbidden wing, whatever had cried out from its hidden chambers, it had been waiting for this moment. And for the first time in decades, someone had listened. The moment the screams had echoed through the abandoned wing, the demolition workers froze in unison, their tools hanging limply at their sides. None of them spoke at first, the sound had been unlike anything they had ever heard. High-pitched, almost frantic, it reverberated through the long corridors, bouncing off rusted tiles and broken walls. Some claimed it was the wind, others muttered about animals trapped in the building, but the expressions on their faces told a different story. Fear had settled in like a shadow, slow, heavy, and impossible to shake. One of the younger workers, barely 20, swallowed audibly, his hand trembling as it hovered over the flashlight switch. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, voice barely audible above the echoing silence. The veteran of the crew, a man who had worked in abandoned buildings for over a decade, shook his head slowly, unwilling to admit what he already suspected. The sound had been too deliberate, too human. Yet, instinctively, he urged everyone to continue, reasoning that it might just be nerves. But as they pressed forward, every step seemed to amplify the darkness around them. Shadows twisted unnaturally along the walls, and the stale air smelled faintly of iron and decay. They reached the first series of locked doors, marked with faded warning signs that read, "Authorized personnel only," and, "Danger, keep out." The chains had rusted decades ago, yet when one worker tried to tug at them, a sharp metallic screech echoed through the hall, causing a few of them to jump. It was as though the building itself resisted intrusion, protesting their presence. The younger worker's hands shook more violently now, gripping his flashlight like a lifeline. "Maybe we shouldn't be here," he whispered again, barely audible over the sudden creak of the floorboards. The others exchanged nervous glances but did not speak. A sudden chill swept through the corridor, carrying with it a faint echo of the scream they had heard earlier. It was distant, almost imperceptible, but it lingered long enough to make every hair on their bodies stand on end. They paused, straining their ears, trying to convince themselves that the sound was a trick of the empty building. Yet even in silence, there was an oppressive weight, a sense that the walls themselves were watching, waiting for them to make a mistake. The veteran finally broke the silence. "We report this to the foreman. No one touches that wing tonight." But as he spoke, a low groan emanated from somewhere deeper inside, a sound that was neither human nor mechanical, like the building itself was speaking through some long-forgotten voice. The group instinctively moved back toward the entrance, but the further they walked, the more signs of the Forbidden Wing's sinister history became impossible to ignore. In a side room, a rusted gurney leaned against the wall, still streaked with dark stains. Broken instruments were scattered across the dusty floor, and the faded letters of a patient's chart clung to the walls like dried leaves. Some of the workers reached out instinctively to touch the chart, and when they did, the wind, or something more deliberate, slammed the door shut behind them with a deafening crash. Heartbeats quickened, and sweat prickled their foreheads despite the cold air. One of the older workers, who had remained unusually silent, whispered with a trembling voice, "It's like, someone or something wants us to leave." The others nodded, too terrified to speak. The sound of distant scratching, like nails along concrete, now echoed from the upper floor. None of the workers dared to look up, fearing what they might see. The building seemed to pulse with life, despite years of abandonment. Every creak, every whisper of the wind, every shadow felt deliberate, choreographed to instill panic. Finally, the team reached the exit, gasping as if they had run a marathon despite moving slowly. The night air hit their faces like a splash of cold water, a sharp contrast to the oppressive staleness of the wing. Hands shook, and their breaths came in ragged bursts. They exchanged frantic, unspoken glances, each realizing that something unexplainable had occurred. When one of them suggested calling the authorities, the group hesitated, reluctant to admit that whatever screamed inside was beyond their understanding, beyond rational explanation. Even as they walked away from the wing, the memory of the screams lingered in their minds, an insistent echo that refused to fade. Their reports would later claim that the sounds were inexplicable, leaving investigators puzzled and the public skeptical. But for the workers, the experience was undeniable. Something horrifying had occurred inside the Forbidden Wing, and they had been forced to witness it. The scream, the chilling groan, the inexplicable movements within the shadows, it was a warning, or perhaps an invitation. By the time the last light of evening disappeared, the workers were standing outside the wing, staring back at the sealed doors. Silence enveloped the building, yet it felt alive, as though holding its breath, waiting for the next visitor. No one dared speak of what they had heard in detail, each fearing ridicule or disbelief. But the unspoken truth was unanimous: something was inside, something that had survived decades of neglect and secrecy, and it had made its presence known. The Forbidden Wing, once ignored and left to decay, had now announced itself. And what they had heard that evening was only the beginning. The Forbidden Wing had not always been silent. Decades earlier, it had thrummed with activity, a hub of cutting-edge medical procedures that the public would never learn about. Officially, it was a psychiatric and medical annex, meant to treat patients deemed difficult or dangerous. But behind its walls, whispers of unethical practices, secret experiments, and unexplained disappearances were common knowledge among those who dared to work there. Nurses spoke of patients who would vanish overnight, doctors who conducted procedures without consent, and administrators who turned a blind eye, prioritizing research and notoriety over humanity. Dr. Elias Thornton, one of the leading figures of the hospital in the mid-20th century, had gained a reputation as a visionary to some and a tyrant to others. He was a man of contradictions, charismatic in meetings, yet cold and calculated in his interactions with patients. Staff who challenged him often found themselves reassigned to the Forbidden Wing under his supervision, where rules were murky and oversight nearly non-existent. Patients recalled him with a mixture of fear and awe, describing late-night sessions in dimly lit rooms where the line between treatment and torment blurred. His experiments were said to involve the human mind in ways that contemporary medicine would consider inhumane: sensory deprivation, electrical stimulation, and experimental drugs administered without consent. The wing itself had been designed with secrecy in mind. Hidden corridors, lockable observation rooms, and reinforced doors created a labyrinth that even staff could get lost in if unprepared. Floor plans were heavily redacted in official records, and few employees outside of Thornton's inner circle knew the true layout. Some corridors were windowless, painted in pale green to create a clinical calm that masked the horror happening inside. Patient records were intentionally vague or misleading, often listing transferred or discharged for individuals who never left the facility alive. Over time, the building developed a reputation among staff and locals alike, a place where those who entered might not return, or if they did, carried invisible scars that were never discussed. Reflecting on their work, the team recognized that confronting the wing's legacy was as much about emotional engagement as it was about documentation. Each scream, each shadow, each fragment of paper represented a life touched by cruelty, fear, or neglect. By piecing together these fragments, investigators gave a voice to those who could no longer speak. The wing, silent for decades, had finally been heard. Its legacy was no longer buried, it had been confronted, catalogued, and honored through acknowledgement. Finally, the investigators left the wing for the last time, locking the doors behind them. Yet, as they stepped into the night, there was an understanding that the wing's presence would linger. Its walls contained echoes of the past, memories of suffering, and reminders of human resilience in the face of cruelty. Confronting the wing's legacy had not erased its history, but it had ensured that the truth, however dark and uncomfortable, would endure. The wing remained, silent yet resonant, a chilling monument to both human suffering and the courage required to face it. Testimonies from former staff painted a disturbing picture. Nurse Margaret Collins, who worked there in the 1960s, described an evening when a patient screamed for hours before being sedated with a cocktail of experimental drugs. She admitted decades later, in a rare interview, that she often closed her eyes and walked away, telling herself it was part of her duty. Others recalled seeing patients restrained on gurneys for days at a time, their families told that they were resting. Records from the time hinted at medical procedures that were never approved, often justified under the guise of research. Even some of the doctors who refused to participate later admitted that fear of losing their licenses or reputations kept them silent. Over time, rumors began to reach the surrounding community. Children claimed they could hear strange noises at night, screams, laughter, whispers that seemed impossibly far away. Local workers who had been tasked with maintenance reported unexplained cold spots, doors that moved on their own, and the occasional fleeting shadow in empty corridors. Yet, the hospital administration dismissed these accounts as superstition or exaggeration. The Forbidden Wing became something of a ghost story for the neighborhood, a place whispered about in fear and curiosity, untouchable by official hands. The patients themselves were largely voiceless, their fates concealed by locked doors and falsified records. Letters from families who tried to investigate were intercepted or redirected, often arriving months later with no answers. Diaries found decades later in sealed storage described long nights of isolation, doctors observing reactions with clinical detachment, and a sense of being constantly watched. In one journal, a patient wrote, "They say this is medicine, but I hear the screams of others and wonder if they are still alive. Sometimes I feel the walls breathing with us." These words, faded and nearly illegible, would later serve as a haunting reminder of what occurred behind the wing's locked doors. Historical records suggest that the wing's decommissioning was far from simple. Publicly, it was closed due to aging infrastructure and budget cuts. Privately, rumors persisted that the hospital wished to erase evidence of practices that could result in legal consequences. Some even suggested that Dr. Thornton's own experiments had left physical and psychological scars so profound that the hospital feared exposure. Employees who attempted to speak publicly were silenced through threats, dismissals, or coercion. It was as though the wing itself demanded secrecy, and for decades, the world complied. By the time demolition plans were announced, the Forbidden Wing had become an enigma wrapped in decades of speculation, half-truths, and terror. While the rest of the hospital was slowly dismantled, this section remained untouched, a silent witness to its own history. Urban explorers, investigators, and thrill-seekers who dared to peek through boarded windows described corridors that seemed to resist intrusion, shadows that lingered unnaturally, and the unmistakable sensation of being watched. The stories converged around one truth: the wing had a dark past that refused to stay buried. And it was precisely that history that made the screams heard by the demolition workers so chilling. They were not just echoes of a building settling, nor were they figments of fear. They were the voice of decades of secrecy, pain, and terror finally demanding recognition. For the first time in years, the world was being reminded that the Forbidden Wing had never truly been abandoned. As investigators would soon learn, the wing's past was only the beginning. Every detail, every record, and every whispered rumor was a thread in a tangled web of human suffering and moral compromise. And somewhere deep within its locked chambers, the consequences of those past actions were still waiting to reveal themselves. The day after the demolition workers fled the wing, city authorities were notified of the inexplicable screams. Initially, skepticism dominated the response. How could a crumbling, abandoned building produce sounds that terrified experienced workers? Yet, a decision was made to send a small team of investigators, combining law enforcement, forensic experts, and, controversially, a couple of independent paranormal consultants who had experience with unexplained phenomena in abandoned sites. The mix of scientific and speculative expertise set the stage for a tense, unpredictable exploration. Upon arrival, the investigators were met with the same oppressive atmosphere that had unnerved the demolition crew. The hospital grounds were overgrown, with weeds curling through cracked concrete, and the wing's boarded windows loomed like dark eyes staring down intruders. The investigators' footsteps crunched on gravel as they approached the entrance, flashlights cutting narrow beams into the encroaching shadows. Every creak of the aging building seemed magnified, echoing across corridors that had long been silent. The air smelled of rust, mold, and the faint, lingering tang of antiseptic from decades past. Inside, the building was a labyrinth of decaying hallways, peeling wallpaper, and abandoned medical equipment. Dust lay thick on every surface, disturbed only by the investigators' careful steps. Papers littered the floors, yellowed and brittle, some scattered by time, others by human hands long gone. The team split into pairs, each carrying digital cameras, recording devices, and notebooks. A pervasive sense of unease hung over them. It was as if the building itself anticipated their every move, and with each step, the tension intensified. The first few rooms appeared innocuous, empty patient wards with rusted beds, long-abandoned nurse stations, and medical carts frozen in decay. Yet, subtle details hinted at something more sinister. One corridor ended in a heavy, locked door marked with a faded "Authorized Personnel Only" sign. Beyond it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound seemed to murmur through the walls. Investigators held their breath, listening, but the noise stopped as abruptly as it had started. Whispered speculation passed between the team members, some attributing it to wind, others to structural stress. But an unspoken fear lingered: something was inside the wing that didn't want to be discovered. As the team progressed, they discovered remnants of the wing's controversial past. Patient files were stacked haphazardly on shelves, some partially burned, others intact but difficult to read. Medical instruments, corroded and unsterilized, lay in neat rows on dusty counters, suggesting a sudden evacuation or hurried abandonment. One investigator photographed a clipboard containing a list of procedures that, according to modern standards, would have been unethical and possibly illegal. The writing was precise, clinical, yet the implications were horrifying. Each discovery added layers of tension, and the investigators began to sense that they were entering a narrative of human suffering that had been deliberately erased. One of the forensic experts, specializing in old medical records, noted inconsistencies in patient documentation. Entire weeks of records were missing, and some patient files appeared to contradict hospital logs. The discrepancies hinted at deliberate obfuscation. As the team delved deeper, the shadows lengthened in the flashlight beams, and the silence became oppressive. Occasional thumps and groans reverberated from the walls, sounds that seemed to follow the investigators' movements rather than occur at random. Even the most rational members of the team could not ignore the sensation of being observed by unseen eyes. In a particularly narrow corridor, they found a door slightly ajar. The air emanating from within was colder, heavier, and carried an unmistakable metallic odor. When the lead investigator gently pushed the door, the room beyond revealed rows of rusted restraints attached to the walls, chains that had not moved for decades, yet looked freshly disturbed. A fallen medical tray clattered to the ground as if nudged by an invisible hand, and the faint echo of a moan or whisper followed, so quiet that some members doubted their own hearing. The room's oppressive atmosphere forced even the skeptical forensic team to step back, their flashlights darting nervously across walls that seemed to close in. Outside, local witnesses had gathered, drawn by the promise of official presence. Some described decades-old sightings of shadowy figures moving through the wing, lights flickering at odd hours, and screams that cut through the night. One elderly neighbor recounted, with trembling hands, seeing nurses wheeling patients in wheelchairs toward the forbidden wing late at night, only for them never to emerge. Investigators took notes, their curiosity mingling with unease. The history of secrecy and disappearance had left tangible traces, and it became increasingly clear that the screams were not isolated incidents, but a symptom of something much larger and deeply buried. As night fell, investigators set up recording equipment throughout the wing. Cameras, motion sensors, and audio recorders captured the emptiness, or at least the emptiness that appeared to humans. The building responded in ways that defied logic. Shadows seemed to move against the light, doors whispered closed, and an occasional scraping echoed from corridors that were entirely empty. One investigator swore he saw a figure at the far end of a hallway, only for it to vanish when approached. Each event ratcheted up tension, creating an almost unbearable suspense. The wing had gone decades without witnesses, and now it was asserting itself with a presence that could not be ignored. By the end of the first night, the investigators emerged exhausted, shaken, and perplexed. Their recordings and notes suggested evidence of both historical atrocities and inexplicable phenomena. The building had revealed fragments of its dark past, yet there were still countless mysteries left undiscovered. The forbidden wing, silent for decades, had once again demanded attention, and it was clear that the full story would require a deeper, more courageous exploration. And somewhere within the locked, shadowed corridors, the wing seemed to pulse with anticipation, as if aware that its secrets were finally being sought. The screams, the strange movements, and the chilling ambience were only the beginning. The investigators were standing at the threshold of a story far larger and more terrifying than they could have imagined. As the investigators dug deeper into the forbidden wing, they began to uncover a pattern that chilled them more than any shadow or unexplained sound. Patients who had entered the wing often vanished from records, their existence erased as though they had never lived. Names disappeared from official hospital logs, birth dates were altered, and in some cases, entire families were left without explanation. The meticulous destruction of evidence suggested premeditation. Someone had gone to great lengths to ensure that the lives within those walls would remain a secret. Among the files discovered, a stack of patient charts painted a disturbing narrative. Each sheet told a story of vulnerability exploited. Individuals brought in for minor psychiatric treatment or physical ailments were subjected to untested procedures. Some charts detailed experimental drugs, applied in dosages far beyond safe limits, while others contained notes on physical restraint, sensory deprivation, or observation periods that stretched for days, sometimes weeks. What made the files truly haunting, however, were the gaps, blank pages where explanations should have been, indicating that some patients simply disappeared without a trace. Investigators began piecing together the personal histories of these patients. One young woman, Eleanor Hayes, had been admitted after reporting persistent nightmares and anxiety. Her diary, found decades later in sealed storage, described a constant fear of being watched, sleepless nights spent in isolation, and the sensation of being experimented on. In her last entry, she wrote, "They say this will help me, but I can hear the others screaming. Sometimes I wonder if we will ever leave these halls alive." Eleanor's fate remained unknown. Her chart simply noted her as transferred to another facility, a transfer that investigators later confirmed never actually occurred. Another patient, Thomas Greer, had been admitted as a teenager for mild behavioral issues. Family members later recounted that he had seemed anxious in the weeks leading up to his admission. According to letters uncovered by investigators, he wrote to his parents pleading for release, describing days spent restrained to a bed and nights of unrelenting experimentation. His letters ended abruptly, with a sentence that simply read, "I think they've forgotten I am human." Investigators noted that Thomas's name had been stricken from official records, a deliberate attempt to remove all evidence of his existence. The human stories made the wing's dark history painfully real. Former staff interviewed decades later spoke of patients who were not only neglected but treated as objects for experimentation. A retired nurse, who requested anonymity, confessed that she often ignored cries for help, fearing repercussions from Dr. Thornton and his team. "You could feel their fear," she admitted, voice trembling even now, and sometimes, at night, you could hear them screaming in ways that felt alive long after the hospital was empty. "We told ourselves it was for science, but we all knew it was something darker." The investigators also uncovered hidden diaries and letters tucked behind walls, behind shelves, and in sealed cabinets. These personal accounts described the emotional torment endured by patients, isolation, constant observation, and the chilling knowledge that escape was impossible. One diary recounted a night when a patient overheard a doctor talking about disposal procedures for those deemed unfit for experimentation. Another described a makeshift soundproofed room where individuals were left alone for hours, their cries echoing off the walls with no response. Every new account heightened the investigators' awareness that the screams heard by demolition workers were echoes of a historical reality, not just random phenomena. Local families still remembered the vanished patients. Elders in the community recounted stories of relatives who had been admitted to the hospital, never to return. Attempts to investigate were often stonewalled by the hospital administration, letters redirected, and inquiries met with polite dismissal. These accounts, when pieced together, created a mosaic of systemic neglect and deliberate erasure. The wing had become a place where human lives could be forgotten at will, and the emotional weight of that knowledge pressed heavily on the investigators. Forensic analysis of surviving patient records revealed a striking detail: the missing patients were not random. They shared characteristics that made them suitable for experimental observation: fragile mental health, limited family support, and lack of social influence. It appeared that the hospital had selectively targeted the most vulnerable, using bureaucratic authority to mask acts that were morally indefensible. The methodical nature of these disappearances suggested decades of planning and coordination, a dark testament to the wing's administrators' commitment to secrecy. Even as investigators documented these harrowing stories, the echoes of the past seemed to linger in the wing itself. Rooms where patients had once been confined retained a peculiar energy, oppressive and almost sentient. The more investigators explored, the more they sensed that the screams heard by the demolition workers decades later were not just sounds of the past but traces of lingering trauma embedded in the very structure. The building seemed to remember the pain, amplifying it, as if demanding acknowledgement. By the end of their examination, the team realized that the human element was the most terrifying aspect of the wing. These were not abstract horrors, they were real people, erased from history, their suffering preserved in fading paper, rusted chains, and whispered memories. The vanished patients were both victims and witnesses, their fates a silent indictment of the system that had sought to control, manipulate, and ultimately forget them. As the investigators left the wing that night, they carried with them a profound sense of responsibility. The screams, the shadows, the blank pages in patient files, all pointed to a truth that demanded telling. The forgotten patients of the wing were no longer invisible, and their stories were poised to challenge not only the investigators but everyone who would hear them. The wing had claimed decades of secrecy, but its victims were finally beginning to speak. As investigators delved deeper into the forbidden wing, a chilling realization began to take hold: the patients' disappearances were only the surface of a far more horrifying reality. Hidden behind locked doors, redacted files, and faded warning signs lay the evidence of experiments that blurred the line between medicine and cruelty. These were not standard treatments, they were deliberate manipulations of the human body and mind, conducted under the guise of scientific advancement, yet without consent, ethics, or oversight. The wing had been a laboratory for the macabre. The first discovery came in a small, soundproofed room, where investigators found a collection of vials and syringes, still neatly arranged despite decades of abandonment. Labels, though faded, revealed names of chemicals and compounds unfamiliar even to modern forensic experts. Some were experimental anesthetics, others psychoactive substances designed to influence behavior. Alongside them were documents detailing the administration of these compounds, dosages, schedules, and observations recorded in clinical precision. Yet it was the footnotes, almost illegible with age, that revealed the true horror. Notes like, "Patient shows signs of distress but procedure continues," and "Response inadequate, increased dosage." The cold, calculated language made it clear that suffering had been measured, quantified, and ignored. Further exploration revealed rooms designed for observation. Thick glass partitions allowed doctors to monitor patients while remaining unseen. In these rooms, equipment for sensory deprivation was discovered: padded isolation chambers, soundproofed enclosures, and devices designed to restrict movement entirely. Investigators found handwritten notes detailing how long patients could be left in isolation, the expected physiological and psychological reactions, and contingency plans for those who became non-compliant. It was meticulous, methodical, and horrifying, a system built to study human distress in controlled conditions. Perhaps most unsettling were the personal journals found hidden in cabinets and behind false walls. They belonged to both patients and staff, and together they painted a picture of a wing where cruelty had been normalized. One entry from a patient described being forced to endure hours of sensory deprivation, the room pitch black, the air stale, the mind screaming for relief. The patient recounted counting days in silence, hearing distant cries, and feeling the presence of those who had come before, trapped in similar conditions. Another journal, written by a nurse decades later, confessed guilt at having participated in these experiments and detailed attempts to subvert the doctor's authority, efforts that were ultimately unsuccessful. Investigators also uncovered evidence of psychological manipulation. Some patients were subjected to intense suggestion, forced to relive trauma, or made to experience fear in controlled environments. Notes described how doctors would induce panic attacks, record responses, and alter treatment plans based on reactions. These were not therapies aimed at healing, they were exercises in control and observation, designed to test the limits of human endurance. The meticulous detail in the records revealed that those conducting the experiments were less concerned with medicine and more with power, the power to observe, control, and dominate. Physical experiments were equally disturbing. Rooms containing rudimentary surgical tables still held rusted clamps and restraints. Sketches found in old notebooks illustrated procedures that combined mechanical devices with chemical administration, often on patients who were immobilized and sedated. The drawings were precise, almost clinical, yet the implications were horrifying. One note suggested testing responses to extreme stimuli, while another hinted at experimental attempts to alter cognitive function. Investigators could not shake the feeling that the screams the demolition workers had heard decades later were echoes of the anguish inflicted in these very chambers. Beyond the clinical records, the wing's architecture itself revealed its sinister purpose. Reflecting on their work, the team recognized that confronting the wing's legacy was as much about emotional engagement as it was about documentation. Each scream, each shadow, each fragment of paper represented a life touched by cruelty, fear, or neglect. By piecing together these fragments, investigators gave a voice to those who could no longer speak. The wing, silent for decades, had finally been heard. Its legacy was no longer buried, it had been confronted, catalogued, and honored through acknowledgement. Finally, the investigators left the wing for the last time, locking the doors behind them. Yet, as they stepped into the night, there was an understanding that the wing's presence would linger. Its walls contained echoes of the past, memories of suffering, and reminders of human resilience in the face of cruelty. Confronting the wing's legacy had not erased its history, but it had ensured that the truth, however dark and uncomfortable, would endure. The wing remained, silent yet resonant, a chilling monument to both human suffering and the courage required to face it. Hidden corridors, false walls, and restricted rooms created a maze where observation could occur without interference. Some rooms had one-way mirrors, while others contained concealed speakers and microphones to monitor reactions. Investigators noted that every detail had been calculated to maximize observation and minimize interference. Even ventilation systems were designed to carry sound in specific ways, potentially explaining why screams could be heard distant from the source. The wing had been built not for treatment, but for systematic study of human suffering. The psychological toll on staff was evident in the journals and reports they left behind. Some wrote of fear, of moral conflict, and of the desperate hope that no one would notice what they were doing. Others rationalized their actions in chillingly clinical terms, referring to patients as subjects and describing acts of cruelty as data points. These writings exposed the moral decay within the walls of the wing, where science and inhumanity were indistinguishable. Even decades later, the investigators could feel the weight of these moral compromises pressing down on them. Perhaps most haunting were the last entries in these hidden records. One note, scrawled hastily on a tattered sheet, read, "We cannot stop now, the experiments must continue. Even if the patients do not survive, their data will." Another warned of consequences should the wing ever be discovered, all records must be destroyed. Nothing can remain that links us to the procedures. These warnings, now decades old, made it painfully clear why the wing had been sealed and largely forgotten. It was a tomb of secrets, deliberately hidden to protect the living from knowledge of what had occurred. Even as investigators catalogued these discoveries, strange occurrences continued. Flashlights flickered inexplicably, and shadows appeared where none should exist. One of the team reported hearing low, almost imperceptible moans in the distance, perfectly synchronized with areas where chemical experiments had been conducted. It was as if the building itself carried the memory of its victims, amplifying their trauma into something tangible, something that could still be perceived by those brave enough to enter. By the end of their investigation, it became clear that the hidden experiments were not mere historical curiosities. They were active reminders that the wing's past had left scars on both space and psyche. The cruelty, the meticulous observation, and the deliberate erasure of human lives had created an enduring presence, one that refused to remain silent. The screams heard by demolition workers were not just echoes, they were the residue of decades of suffering, preserved within walls that had witnessed horrors no human should endure. The forbidden wing was no longer simply abandoned, it was alive with memory, trauma, and secrets. Investigators realized that understanding the experiments, cataloging their evidence, and telling the story of the patients who had vanished was only the beginning. The wing demanded more than documentation, it demanded reckoning. And somewhere deep within its locked chambers, the full extent of its dark past was still waiting to be revealed. With evidence of the wing's horrifying experiments and vanished patients mounting, investigators turned to a new, equally crucial source: witnesses. Local residents, former staff, and even relatives of missing patients held fragments of the story that had been carefully hidden for decades. Their accounts were inconsistent, fragmented, and often contradictory, but together they created a mosaic of truth, one that exposed the human cost behind the Forbidden Wing's dark legacy. The first witnesses were the demolition workers themselves, still visibly shaken from the night they heard the screams. Their testimony was precise in its terror: the pitch, intensity, and direction of the sounds, the cold spots in corridors, and the unexplainable movement of objects. Each worker recalled the oppressive atmosphere that had gripped them, the sensation of being watched, and the feeling that the wing itself was alive. Investigators noted the subtle differences in how each described events, yet a consistent theme emerged: whatever was inside that wing had been waiting, observing, and communicating its presence. Former staff members, many now elderly, added a historical perspective. A retired nurse recalled seeing patients wheeled into restricted rooms that were never documented in official logs. She admitted she often left without asking questions, citing fear of Dr. Thornton and the authority of the wing's administration. "We all knew something was wrong," she confessed, voice trembling decades later, "but no one dared say it aloud. You did what you were told, and you survived." Others spoke of hearing screams late at night, muffled cries that echoed in the empty hallways, and shadows that seemed to move independently of light. Their memories, though fragmented, painted a vivid portrait of the wing as a place where ordinary fear intersected with unimaginable cruelty. Neighbors of the hospital contributed unsettling accounts. Some described nights when lights flickered inside the wing despite no electricity being supplied. Others claimed to hear distant moans or low, rhythmic cries, sometimes lasting for hours. Children who lived nearby remembered the feeling of being watched, of shadows moving across the lawn, and a sense of danger that was palpable even from the street. While some dismissed these recollections as superstition, investigators noticed correlations between the locations of reported sightings and the areas where experiments had been documented, suggesting that the wing's malevolent presence extended beyond its walls. Family members of vanished patients shared stories that were equally haunting. One woman recounted how her brother, admitted for mild psychological issues, had been taken to the Forbidden Wing and never returned. Letters she had sent to the hospital went unanswered or were returned with vague explanations. Another family described visiting their son, only to be told he had been transferred to another facility, a transfer that never occurred. These testimonies revealed a pattern of deliberate erasure, manipulation of records, and psychological trauma inflicted on both patients and their families. The human element of these accounts was undeniable. It added a level of emotional weight that historical records alone could never convey. Investigators also interviewed whistleblowers who had risked careers to speak out. One former assistant revealed that administrators went to great lengths to maintain secrecy, redacting files, redirecting inquiries, and threatening those who questioned procedures. These accounts confirmed suspicions that the wing's horrors were not accidental but carefully orchestrated and systematically hidden. The courage of these witnesses contrasted sharply with the calculated cruelty documented in records, highlighting the moral complexity surrounding the wing's history. Yet the most unsettling testimonies were those from individuals who claimed to have experienced or witnessed inexplicable phenomena inside the wing. One retired janitor described being on night duty when he felt a cold hand brush against his shoulder, though no one was there. Another spoke of seeing fleeting figures in empty corridors, hearing whispered words that made no sense, and feeling an intense presence that followed him through the halls. Investigators approached these accounts cautiously, aware of the human tendency toward exaggeration, but the consistency of details, locations, and sensations lent credibility to the claims. As investigators cross-referenced these stories, patterns emerged. Specific rooms, doors, and corridors were repeatedly mentioned, spaces where screams had originated, where shadows had been seen, and where patients had been mistreated. The convergence of historical evidence and eyewitness testimony painted a picture of a wing that was not only a site of past cruelty but an active repository of memory and trauma. The building itself seemed to retain the experiences of those who had suffered within its walls, projecting them in ways that could still be perceived decades later. In some cases, witnesses' emotional responses revealed the long-lasting psychological impact. Families expressed unresolved grief, former staff showed guilt and fear, and neighbors recounted lingering anxiety from childhood. Each story was a thread, weaving a tapestry of suffering, secrecy, and fear. The Forbidden Wing had left an indelible mark not only on its immediate victims but on the broader community, a haunting legacy that investigators now sought to document comprehensively. By the end of these interviews, it became clear that the Forbidden Wing was far more than an abandoned medical facility. It was a repository of human experience, cruelty, and trauma, a place where ethics had been subverted and lives erased. The witnesses had spoken, and though their accounts varied in detail, the overarching narrative was undeniable: the wing had been a theater of suffering, and its echoes still resonated. Investigators left with a heightened sense of responsibility, knowing that their task was not merely to record history but to confront the living remnants of a dark past that refused to remain buried. The wing, silent to the casual observer, had found its voice through the memories of those who had survived and those who had witnessed its horrors. And as the investigators prepared for their next phase of exploration, they understood that the voices of the witnesses were only the beginning, that the building itself, with all its hidden corridors and shadowed rooms, still held secrets waiting to be uncovered. After gathering witness testimonies and cataloging decades of disturbing records, the investigative team decided to return to the Forbidden Wing at night. What had occurred during the day could be rationalized: shadows, creaks, and residual fear. But nightfall promised an entirely different experience, one that might reveal the full scope of the wing's dark legacy. Armed with cameras, audio recorders, flashlights, and protective gear, the team approached the building with a mixture of dread and determination. The air was colder than anticipated, a damp, metallic chill that seemed to emanate from the building itself. As they stepped inside, the wing greeted them in silence, but a silence so complete it was almost oppressive. Every creak of the floorboard sounded magnified, every gust of wind through broken windows seemed deliberate. Dust particles hung suspended in the flashlight beams, as if frozen in time, creating ghostly outlines of furniture, gurneys, and discarded equipment. The investigators moved slowly, aware that the history of cruelty and suffering was embedded in every corner. Their footsteps echoed off walls that had once contained screams, and the faint metallic tang of long-dried blood hung in the air, subtle but unmistakable. They split into pairs, as before, to cover more ground. One pair entered the observation rooms, where decades ago patients had been studied through one-way mirrors. The walls were yellowed and cracked, the glass still streaked with grime and dust, yet something about the room felt alive. A faint whispering seemed to brush against the investigators' ears, soft enough to question reality but persistent enough to unsettle. They found notebooks left in hidden compartments, their pages brittle and filled with clinical notations interspersed with frantic scribbles, notes that suggested fear, both from the observers and the observed. Meanwhile, another pair explored the isolation chambers, now empty but still echoing with past trauma. The padded walls, meant to dull sound, seemed to amplify it in some inexplicable way. As they stepped inside, the temperature dropped sharply, their breath visible in the beams of their flashlights. One investigator swore he heard a faint moan emanate from a corner of the chamber, only to have it vanish when he turned. It was impossible to determine whether it was the wind, a structural creak, or something else entirely. The oppressive atmosphere made rational thought difficult. Each investigator felt a weight on their shoulders, a pressure as if the building itself were judging their intrusion. As the night deepened, strange occurrences became more pronounced. Doors that had been closed were found slightly ajar when revisited, shadows moved independently of light sources, and distant footsteps echoed in empty corridors. Investigators reported a sensation of being followed, unseen eyes tracking their every move. Audio recorders later captured low-frequency sounds imperceptible to the human ear at the time, vibrations, groans, and intermittent shrieks, aligning with areas where hidden experiments had once taken place. It became increasingly clear that the wing was reacting to their presence, drawing attention to spaces that had once been the epicenter of pain. In one hallway, the team discovered a door partially concealed behind a collapsed wall. It led to a sublevel that had been sealed off decades ago. The air was almost suffocating, heavy with a combination of mold, rust, and an indefinable presence. Flashlights revealed a room lined with rusted medical equipment and restraints, some with dried stains. One of the investigators noticed faint markings on the walls, clawed lines that suggested desperate attempts to escape. The silence was broken only by the occasional echo of distant screams, at first, subtle, then growing in intensity, as if the building itself were expressing decades of pent-up anguish. As they explored further, the investigators stumbled upon a series of hidden rooms connected by narrow, windowless corridors. The architecture of the wing had been purposefully labyrinthine, designed to confuse, isolate, and observe. Within these rooms, remnants of psychological experiments were evident, faded charts detailing sensory deprivation trials, mechanical devices used for restraint, and notes on behavioral manipulation. One notebook contained detailed observations of patient reactions to fear stimuli, sound, light, and isolation, all meticulously documented. The investigators were confronted with the stark reality that human suffering had been systematized, studied, and erased over decades. Then came the moment that would be remembered by all present. In the deepest part of the wing, one investigator's flashlight flickered, plunging the corridor into near darkness. A scream erupted, sharp, desperate, unmistakably human. It was unlike any sound they had encountered before, vibrating through the walls, floor, and ceiling. The team froze, hearts pounding, each breath coming in ragged gasps. The scream seemed to originate from multiple directions simultaneously, echoing through the corridors with a resonance that defied physics. Some investigators instinctively took a step back, while others were rooted in place, unable to tear their eyes from the shadows where the sound seemed most intense. Panic set in as the team tried to regroup. The corridors twisted in ways that seemed impossible, doors led to rooms that appeared larger on the inside than the outside, and shadows coalesced into humanoid shapes before dissolving when approached. Flashlights flickered violently, and one recording device captured a low, guttural whisper repeating the word "help" over and over. The investigators realized that the screams they had been chasing were not echoes of the past alone. The wing had become a conduit for trauma, projecting it into the present, interacting with those who dared enter. Some attempted to communicate, calling out to see if any survivors remained, but only silence answered, punctuated by the occasional whisper or creak. The team felt a profound mixture of fear, sorrow, and responsibility. They were witnesses to decades of suffering, confronted with the lingering presence of the wing's victims. The experience was so intense that time seemed to distort, minutes stretched into hours, and what should have been straightforward corridors became a confusing maze, as though the building were actively reshaping itself to confound them. By the early hours of the morning, the team had retraced their steps, documenting every detail, capturing audio and video evidence, and trying to make sense of the phenomena. They emerged exhausted, shaken, and forever altered by what they had encountered. The screams, the shadows, the inexplicable movements, they were reminders that the wing was not just a building of brick and mortar, but a living repository of trauma. The night had revealed a truth more horrifying than any record could convey: the forbidden wing's past had not stayed in the past. It was alive, waiting, and aware. As the investigators stepped out into the cold dawn, the wing stood silent once more, its secrets partially exposed but far from fully understood. The experience had confirmed what many had feared, that the screams heard by demolition workers decades earlier were real, that the wing's dark past had left an imprint that could still manifest in the present, and that the human suffering contained within its walls demanded acknowledgement. The night had changed everything. The wing's legacy was no longer confined to history. In the days following the night investigation, the team meticulously reviewed every piece of evidence collected: audio recordings, photographs, video footage, and the decades-old documents discovered within the wing. Each item told a fragment of the larger story, and when pieced together, the narrative was far darker than anyone had initially anticipated. The combination of historical documentation, eyewitness accounts, and unexplained phenomena suggested that the Forbidden Wing was more than a site of past cruelty, it was a living testament to human suffering that had left physical and psychological imprints behind. Audio recordings captured a range of unnerving sounds. Low-frequency hums, imperceptible at first, revealed themselves as distinct vibrations that seemed to originate from deep within the structure. Whispered phrases emerged faintly on playback, phrases such as, "Help me, don't leave," and, "They're watching," interspersed with sporadic, high-pitched shrieks. Investigators debated whether these were echoes of the past or some residual energy imprinted upon the wing. Regardless, the recordings were consistent across multiple devices and positions, suggesting that the building itself somehow carried the memory of decades-old trauma. Photographs revealed subtle anomalies. Shadows in hallways appeared elongated and moved independently of light sources. In several images, investigators noticed faint figures at the far end of corridors, blurry and translucent, almost like apparitions caught mid-motion. Attempts to replicate these anomalies in controlled conditions failed. Nothing could explain their presence except the notion that the wing retained echoes of the people who had suffered within it. Each image carried a sense of unease, a visual reminder of the human cost embedded in the structure. Historical documents and patient records painted a harrowing picture of deliberate, systematic cruelty. Procedures once conducted under the guise of research were now clearly unethical, with notes detailing patient distress, prolonged isolation, and experimental chemical administration. Entire patient files were missing or had been deliberately altered, confirming the deliberate erasure of human lives. Investigators noted patterns in the disappearances, identifying clusters of patients who had been admitted during specific periods, all of whom vanished under suspicious circumstances. The consistency of these records pointed to an organized effort to conceal the truth. Investigators also uncovered evidence of psychological manipulation designed to instill fear and compliance. Detailed notes described sensory deprivation tests, forced isolation, and behavioral conditioning. Patients were observed under extreme stress, with reactions meticulously documented. Some records revealed attempts to provoke panic attacks or test reactions to pain and fear stimuli. The meticulous nature of these experiments made clear that the wing's administrators were less concerned with treatment than with power, control, and observation. The human element, the suffering, was reduced to data points, catalogued in a clinical yet terrifyingly inhuman manner. Corroborating witness testimonies strengthened the narrative. Former staff members, demolition workers, and local residents all described sensations of being watched, hearing distant cries, and observing shadows that seemed to move with intent. While initially dismissed as superstition or imagination, the alignment of these accounts with historical records and unexplained phenomena suggested otherwise. The wing's past had left an enduring mark, one that could still be perceived and interacted with decades later. It was not merely a site of historical interest, it was a vessel of memory, trauma, and lingering fear. One of the most striking revelations came from cross-referencing photographs with historical floor plans. Investigators discovered previously undocumented rooms, hidden passageways, and structural anomalies that had no official record. Some of these spaces corresponded with areas where audio anomalies were strongest, and where witnesses had reported seeing shadows or hearing unexplained sounds. The architecture itself seemed deliberately designed to isolate, observe, and manipulate, reinforcing the conclusion that the wing's design was intrinsically tied to its dark purpose. During a careful review of video footage, investigators noted interactions with the environment that defied explanation. Doors moved without contact, objects shifted subtly, and shadows appeared to detach from surfaces and move independently. In several frames, faint outlines resembling human figures appeared briefly before dissolving. These anomalies were consistent across multiple recordings and angles, reinforcing the possibility that the wing retained a form of sentient memory, a residual imprint of the suffering that had occurred there. The investigators began to understand that the Forbidden Wing was not merely haunted in legend, it actively manifested its past to those who entered. One particularly chilling piece of evidence was a notebook found in a previously sealed storage room. Its pages contained first-hand observations from a mid-century doctor who worked under Dr. Thornton. Unlike other records, these notes included candid reflections on fear, guilt, and moral conflict. The doctor confessed to participating in experiments while simultaneously acknowledging the suffering inflicted on patients. He warned that the wing must remain sealed and that its secrets should never be uncovered. Investigators noted the irony: despite decades of secrecy, the wing's horrors were now being revealed precisely because of the courage of those willing to investigate. By the conclusion of their evidence review, the team faced an undeniable truth: the Forbidden Wing was a complex, living record of human suffering. The combination of unethical experiments, deliberate erasure of patient histories, architectural manipulation, and residual phenomena created a narrative that was as horrifying as it was compelling. Each piece of evidence reinforced the others, creating a cohesive but disturbing tapestry of cruelty, secrecy, and lingering trauma. The investigators understood that revealing these findings would not only illuminate historical atrocities but also challenge perceptions of reality, memory, and human resilience. The wing's secrets, once buried under layers of bureaucracy and time, were now being systematically documented. Investigators realized that the screams, the shadows, the inexplicable movements, and the human testimonies all pointed to a singular, undeniable conclusion: the Forbidden Wing had never truly been abandoned. Its past was alive, present, and demanding acknowledgement. Every discovery, every revelation, and every unexplained phenomenon underscored a haunting truth: history had left a mark, and those who dared to explore it could feel the weight of every vanished life, every scream, and every act of cruelty that had transpired within its walls. After weeks of investigation, the team faced the most difficult challenge yet: confronting the Forbidden Wing's legacy in a way that honored the victims while making sense of the evidence. The building itself, with its labyrinthine corridors, hidden rooms, and residual trauma, seemed to resist closure. Each hallway whispered its history, every shadow hinted at suffering long past. Investigators realized that understanding the wing's legacy meant acknowledging not only the structural and procedural horrors but also the human stories interwoven throughout decades of secrecy, neglect, and deliberate cruelty. The first step involved synthesizing the extensive evidence gathered. Audio recordings captured decades-old screams, whispers, and moans, corroborated by eyewitness testimony from demolition workers, neighbors, and former staff. Photographs revealed strange, ghostly anomalies in rooms where unethical experiments had been conducted, while historical patient files illustrated a systematic pattern of erasure, neglect, and experimentation. Hidden notebooks and diaries provided intimate insight into both the suffering of patients and the moral compromises of staff. The investigators recognized that the wing's legacy was multidimensional, blending documented atrocities with inexplicable phenomena that transcended rational explanation. To confront this legacy, the team revisited the wing for a final, methodical sweep. They sought not only to document its current state but also to witness any residual traces of trauma, memory, or energy that remained. As they navigated the familiar corridors, the oppressive atmosphere intensified. Shadows seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally, and the faint hum of ventilation carried echoes of past cries. Each room held remnants of history: rusted gurneys, faded charts, padded isolation chambers, silent testaments to decades of suffering. The investigators moved deliberately, aware that every step was both an exploration and an act of acknowledgement. In one chamber, investigators found a collection of patient files that had previously gone unnoticed. The records revealed details of patients' daily routines, treatments, and experimental procedures, providing clarity about the scope of unethical experimentation. Names long thought erased surfaced, accompanied by notes describing their physical and psychological responses. Reading these files, investigators felt the weight of human lives reduced to clinical data, and a profound responsibility to give voice to those silenced decades ago. It became clear that confronting the wing's legacy required translating this evidence into a narrative that could be understood and acknowledged by the public. The team also conducted interviews with surviving staff and relatives of former patients to ensure that first-hand accounts were included in the historical record. These interviews provided emotional context, illustrating the human consequences of the wing's operations. Families described loss, confusion, and long-lasting trauma, while former staff conveyed fear, guilt, and moral conflict. The investigators carefully cross-referenced these testimonies with historical documents, confirming patterns of abuse and erasure. The convergence of personal stories and documented evidence created a chilling but necessary tapestry of truth. One of the most poignant discoveries came from a series of letters found hidden behind a wall in the wing. Written by a nurse in the 1960s, they described her internal struggle, the conflict between duty and conscience, fear of Dr. Thornton, and growing horror at the experiments. Her letters detailed moments when she attempted to help patients covertly, providing comfort where she could, even as the system around her enforced cruelty. These letters humanized the staff, illustrating that some attempted to resist the wing's machinery of suffering, even if ultimately powerless. For investigators, this provided crucial insight into the moral complexity embedded within the wing's history. As night fell, the investigators conducted a final walkthrough. The wing seemed alive, responding subtly to their presence. Doors creaked in hallways long abandoned, shadows flickered at the edge of their vision, and faint whispers echoed from unseen corners. Rather than fear, however, investigators approached these phenomena with reverence, understanding that the wing's lingering presence was a manifestation of the lives, emotions, and experiences contained within its walls. In a sense, acknowledging these traces was a form of closure, not for the building, but for the people whose suffering had defined it. The investigators compiled their findings into a comprehensive report, combining documented evidence, eyewitness accounts, audiovisual material, and personal narratives. The report emphasized the duality of the wing's legacy. It was a site of unspeakable cruelty, but also a repository of memory and resilience. The wing's history, long hidden and ignored, was now exposed to public scrutiny, ensuring that the stories of the vanished, the experimented upon, and the morally conflicted staff would not be forgotten. Reflecting on their work, the team recognized that confronting the wing's legacy was as much about emotional engagement as it was about documentation. Each scream, each shadow, each fragment of paper represented a life touched by cruelty, fear, or neglect. By piecing together these fragments, investigators gave a voice to those who could no longer speak. The wing, silent for decades, had finally been heard. Its legacy was no longer buried, it had been confronted, catalogued, and honored through acknowledgement. Finally, the investigators left the wing for the last time, locking the doors behind them. Yet, as they stepped into the night, there was an understanding that the wing's presence would linger. Its walls contained echoes of the past, memories of suffering, and reminders of human resilience in the face of cruelty. Confronting the wing's legacy had not erased its history, but it had ensured that the truth, however dark and uncomfortable, would endure. The wing remained, silent yet resonant, a chilling monument to both human suffering and the courage required to face it.